second How to Study the Bible class. Welcome back to our people who were here last time, and welcome to our new faces. We are so glad that you guys have come. If this is your first time, I hope you got a chance to watch the video that we recorded of the first lesson. If you didn't, it's okay. It's on the AIM YouTube page. I do recommend going back and looking at it at some point before maybe our next session, because the whole point of this class is that we are looking at the Bible chronologically. We're not going over every story in the Bible, but we're going over the major covenants. So in our last class, we talked about creation, we talked about the Garden of Eden, we talked about the fall and Noah's Ark, and then we talked about the Noahic covenant. So if you want to know how all those things fit into what we're going to talk about today, then you need to go back and watch that video. It's about an hour long, so brace yourself for it. Okay. Today we're going to be jumping forward a little bit in our Bible timeline. Like I said, in our first class we covered creation. In this class we are jumping forward to the patriarchs. Now, the patriarchs are the founding fathers of our faith. This is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. I'm sure you guys know at least some of those names and some of the stories that are around them, but we're really going to focus in today on specifically Abraham and the covenant that God makes with Abraham, and how that plays a role in like everything we're going to see playing out in the rest of the Bible. It's a big one. Before we do that though, I wanted to take just a minute to talk about something that I feel like we probably should have talked about before our last class, but I think I was a little bit too eager to get started. But I was thinking about it this week, and I really, based on kind of some of the things the conversations that we had last week, and I wanted to talk just a minute about like the why of this class. Like, we talked in our first session about how the goal of this class is to show you guys or teach you guys how to read the Bible as like one long story that's pointing to Jesus, right? Everything's interconnected, everything's there for a purpose. But why is it important to read the Bible as one interconnected story pointing to Jesus? Like, why is it important to read the Bible at all, really? And what is it that we are hoping to accomplish when we do? And what is the Bible really like for? Like, what is its goal? And so one of the things that we talked about kind of last session with our creation story was how the Bible is not a science textbook, right? Like, the reason our creation story is the way it is, and not breaking down like all the molecules and explaining how the solar system works, is because that wasn't what God was trying to accomplish. Similarly, with this lesson, we're going to be like reading a lot of stories about, again, those founding fathers, and some of them we'll read like kind of like a history book a little bit. But the thing I want to stress is that, again, the Bible is not a history book. Now, while there's a lot of factual historical information in the Bible, its goal is not to convey every detail to you. Its goal is not for you to be able to leave here and rattle off a bunch of names or dates or kings or battles. Like, that's not what we're doing in here. So if it's not a history book, it's not a science book, not a self-help book, right? It's not here just to teach you about yourself, though it can do that. So what is it? What is the Bible about? Anybody?
Jesus.
Good. It's about Jesus. It's about God, right? It's about teaching us to know God better. It tells us about Him, and it brings us closer to Him. So as believers, we recognize that the Bible is the divinely inspired Word of God. So what that means is that we believe that God worked through the biblical authors to communicate information to us about Him that He wants us to know. And so what we can understand from that is that there is nothing in the Bible about God that He does not want you to know about Him. So we had a lot of conversations in our last class about, is God like this? Why would He do this? And I think sometimes we kind of get off into off into the weeds a little bit about like the details. But when we pull it back and we think, okay, this is the information that God gave us because He wants us to know Him better. So what I want us to do in this class, in our first class we established that covenant, right? That in order to study our Bibles, we were going to actually read our Bibles. You remember making that agreement in our first class? In this class, I want to expand our covenant just a little bit and say this, that when we are reading the Bible, whether it is at home, it's at church, or it is in this classroom together, that we are reading it with the purpose of encountering God. What does that mean? Well, it means that when we read the Bible, we're reading as believers, that with the belief that God is here to speak to us through the words in this book. So when we talk about God and the things that he's doing in this book, I want us to be mindful of who we're talking about, for one thing. We're here to ask the challenging questions and to think the hard thoughts. But one of the things we're not really here to do is we're not really here to question God's motives or his character. We're here to learn about the God that we already love as believers. Does that make sense? We all kind of see how there's like just a slightly different approach than just you guys coming and learning just a bunch of information about the Bible. Like, if you leave here and you don't really remember any of like the major names and places, I'm fine with that. But if you know God a little bit better and you can say this is who God is and this is his character and his nature, then we have accomplished very much in here. Good? So that being said, would somebody please open us up in prayer? Oh, come on. Yes. Okay. Yeah, really? Go for it, man. You got it, man.
Right. Dear God, please grant us the clarity of mind to have an open mind while we are studying your word. Please grant us to also be open to all the possibilities of learning and let us wonder how we can apply this to our lives. Thank you, Lord, for using all of the biblical authors that have written the Bible for us and passing it down from generation to generation so that way we can live in your view and also be able to be reunited with you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Kay. Okay. So like I said, we are, what is mine? Do I have a thing? Yes, I do. A little bit of pointer. We are here. We're on the patriarchs. Last lesson we covered creation up to Noah's Ark, and I left you guys with a little bit of homework. And that was to go back and read Genesis 1 by yourself, watch the Bible Project video, which I hope you did that. But really, the last part of the homework was to read Genesis 11, which is the Tower of Babel. Did anybody actually do that homework? Anthony! All right. Big points for Anthony. It's okay if you didn't. The Tower of Babel story is actually really, really short. I do want to take a second for us to go over it before we move into Abraham, because I think with the Tower of Babel, we see that theme that we were seeing at the beginning of Genesis, where humanity is kind of constantly moving itself towards sinfulness and chaos, kind of, it's reiterated. In what? And other gods moving, like this is what we see happening in the Tower of Babel. So if you will, does everybody have a Bible in front of them? We're using our real Bibles and not our apps. We have, let's see, we've got a couple here. Here's one. I think everybody's got one. Looks like everybody's got one. Okay. So let's go to Genesis 11. I think it's on page 9. Yeah. Genesis 11. And let's just read 1 through 9. Anybody read 1 through 9 for us, Genesis 11? Go ahead, Kay.
At one time, all the people of the world spoke the same language and used the same words. As the people migrated to the east, they found a plain in the land of Babylonia and settled there. They began saying to each other, "Let's make bricks and harden them with fire." In this region, bricks were used instead of stone, and tar was used for mortar.
Bless you.
Then they said, "Come, let's build a great city for ourselves. with a tower that reaches into the sky. This will make us famous and keep us from being scattered all over the world. But the Lord came down to look at the city and the tower the people were building. Look, he said, the people are united and they all speak the same language. After this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down and confuse the people with different languages. Then they won't be able to understand each other. In that way, the Lord scattered them all over the world, and they stopped building the city. That is why the city was called Babel, because that is where the Lord confused the people with different languages. In this way, he scattered them all over the world.
All right, so interesting story, right?
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit confusing about like what's the problem here, right? Because here you have a group of people. Presumably these are our descendants from Noah's sons that we talked about in the last section. Like this is where all the people of the world are coming from. We have now a group of them who is like basically invented civilization, right? They are living together, they are working together, they figured out how to make some bricks, and they're going to do something with it, right? And none of those things sound bad or are bad, right? There's nothing wrong with like industry and civilization. But what is it that we see them, like what is their intent with building this tower? They said they're going to build a tower, right? It's going to go up to the heavens. And why are they going to build this tower?
To worship. I was going to say worship the God, but I don't know if that's 100% correct.
Yeah, go back and look at the text. Look at verse 4. What does it say there?
I would say famousy.
Okay. So yeah, it says to be famous, right? Yeah, and I don't love this NLT translation of this, and the King James, I think it hits on the head a bit more. It's like they want to make a name for themselves. They want to be known. When we think about fame, like modern day fame, it's a little bit more complicated than that. In ancient Mesopotamia, the idea of making a great name for yourself was a little bit different. It kind of was this idea of like, we want to make ourselves like, we want to get closer to God and make ourselves a little bit more equal with him, right? And so we see that their intentions are not good. Their intentions are not to be closer to God so that they can like just be in God's presence again, right? That was what happened in Eden. We got booted out. Now we're far from God's presence. They're not trying to get back into that space just for the sake of being close to God. They're doing it with the intent of making a name for themselves. So this is probably what they were building or something similar to this. This is called a ziggurat. These were common in ancient Mesopotamia. These were common amongst other civilizations. What'd you say?
That's just a Minecraft thing.
Yeah, it's Minecraft. That's excellent, yes. It does kind of look like something you would build in Minecraft, you're right. But the idea is that it's like these like steeple terraces, right, that eventually go up to this tower. And God was supposed to live at the top of this tower. Now, not necessarily God that we're talking about in the Bible. So our God, his proper name is Yahweh. So in some of these older stories where we're talking about lots of gods, it may get a little bit confusing. So occasionally I will just refer to him as Yahweh so that we will zero back in on that we are talking about the one true God. But these were things that were built to like lots of different gods. This is not specific to something that was being built to Yahweh. So again, we have like this idea that the people that are building this tower here, they're doing it with the intent of being competitive, of making themselves look good. And it wasn't about like spreading the news of the one true God. That wasn't their intent. And so what we see is God doing something about it, right? He mixes up their languages, so we get this kind of cool origin story about where all these different languages in the world come from, which I think is kind of neat. And then he scatters them. And it's like, oh, okay, well, again, why would God do that, right? Why would he scatter them? Does anybody have any thoughts on why? Okay.
Because they might have spoke different languages, but then at some point in time they would have started to learn what each language meant. And he didn't want them to do. He wanted that to be impossible in some areas, but he just
Yeah, I think you're on it there. What do you got, Anthony?
Psalm went on.
It's like my thought process was like, maybe I had to relate to like the before Noah's flood, where like everyone, like I'm assuming, spoke the same language, and that could have been like one of the major factors that first of all caused them to like grow as evil as they got.
It's a good thought, yeah. I mean, what we have seen from the trajectory of humanity so far, from Garden of Eden up until this point of Tower of Babel, is that when they're kind of left to their own devices, they're going to get themselves in trouble. And so this is one way that God is kind of dispersing that a little bit. But there's also this idea that's happening in this story about like, it's almost like this sense of like pride and nationalism in a space that God is not real interested in. Like, so he's sending them out so that they will be kind of dispersed amongst this area instead of all grouped together in one area. And we'll see how like kind of this plays into the story as we go along. That's our Tower of Babel story. Like I said, it follows those same themes that we saw from the creation, from the Garden of Eden, from Noah, about how humanity is always striving to get itself in trouble in some way. And then God has to step in and sort of reconcile that. So now we're going to hop into, what's next? This. We're going to talk about the patriarchs. We're going to watch this, I think it's an 8-minute video, Bible project on the back half of Genesis, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. This will give us a good overview of what we're going over today, and then we will start reading about Abraham when this is done. Hopefully I have volume. Let's see.
The book of Genesis. In the first video, we saw how chapters 1 through 11 set up the basic storyline of the Bible. God has created all things, and he makes humans in his image to rule the world on his behalf. And humans choose sin and rebellion, and so the world spins out of control into violence and death, all leading up to the rebellion and scattering of the people in Babylon. And so the big question is, what is God going to do to rescue and redeem his world? Well, out of that scattering at Babylon, the author traces a genealogy of just one family that leads eventually to a man named Abram, later known as Abraham. And God's promise to Abraham at the beginning of chapter 12 opens up a whole new movement in the story. God calls Abraham to leave his home and go to the land of Canaan, which God says will become his one day. And in that land, God promises to make Abraham into a great nation, to make his name great and to bless him. Now, these promises are connected back to earlier parts of the book. So Babylon had arrogantly tried to make a great name for itself, and that didn't go over very well. But God, in his generosity, is going to bestow a great name on this no-name guy, Abraham. And God's blessing of Abraham echoes all the way back to that original blessing God gave humanity in the beginning. So the question is, why is God going to bless Abraham and his family? And the last line of God's promise makes this clear. So that all the families of the earth will find God's blessing in you. Now this is key for understanding the whole rest of the biblical story. God's plan is to rescue and to bless his rebellious world through Abraham's family. And this is why the whole rest of the Old Testament story is just going to focus on this one family, eventually called the people of Israel. This is also why Israel will later be called a kingdom of priests at Mount Sinai. God wants to use them to show all of the other nations what he's like. And ultimately, this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets and poets who say that its fulfillment will come through Israel's messianic king, whose reign will bring justice and peace to all of the nations. Now, at this point of the story, that's clear. You just have to keep reading and watch the promise develop. And so the rest of the book focuses on Abraham and his family. First, Abraham himself, then his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons. And the stories about each generation, they're united by two main themes. So first, each generation of Abraham's family is marked by repeated failure. They just keep making really bad decisions that mess up their lives and that put God's promise in jeopardy. However, God remains faithful to them. He keeps rescuing them from themselves and reaffirming his commitment to bless them and bless the nations through them despite their failings. So the Abraham stories. God had promised Abraham a huge family, but on two different occasions, he's afraid for his life because other men are attracted to his wife, and so he denies that he's even married to her, which creates, of course, all of this problem. And not only that, Abraham and his wife Sarah, they can't have children, and so Sarah arranges for Abraham to sleep with one of their servant girls, which also creates all of these problems in the family. But each time, God bails Abraham out. And in chapters 15 and 17, God even formalizes his promise to Abraham with an official commitment called a covenant. This is a classic scene. God invites Abraham to look up at the night stars and to count them. And he says, that's how numerous your family is going to be. And despite all of the odds, having no kids and no way to have any at the moment, Abraham looks up in the sky and simply trusts God's promise. And God responds by entering into a covenant with Abraham, promising that he will become a father of many nations, that God's blessing may come to the whole world. God asks Abraham to mark his family with the sign of the covenant, circumcision of all the male boys in the family. This is a symbol to remind them that the fruitfulness of the family is a gift from God. And so Abraham has lots of kids eventually, and he dies at a good old age. Now the Jacob stories play out these themes even more dramatically. From birth, Jacob lives up to the meaning of his name, which is deceiver. He cheats his brother Esau out of his inheritance and blessing, and he does it by deceiving his old blind father, no less, and then he just takes off. He goes on to take 4 wives, even though he really only loves one, Rachel, and this creates all of these rivalries in the family. The only thing that humbles Jacob is being deceived by his uncle Laban, who cheats him out of years of his life. The tables have finally turned. And so it's a humbled Jacob that returns to his homeland. And in a very strange story, Jacob ends up wrestling with God as he demands that God bless him. Some things never really change, do they? However, God honors his determination, and he passes Abraham's blessing on to him. And he renames Jacob as Israel, which means wrestles with God. Now, it's this last part of the book, the story of Jacob's sons, where all the themes come to a head. Jacob loves his second to youngest son, Joseph, more than any of the others, and he gives him this special jacket. And the 10 older sons come to hate Joseph, and so they kidnap him, and they plan to kill him, but instead they decide to just sell him into slavery in Egypt, where he ends up in prison. Talk about family failure. But God is with Joseph, and he orchestrates Joseph's release from prison. Pharaoh ends up elevating Joseph to second in command over all of Egypt. And so Joseph saves the nation of Egypt during a famine. And he also ends up saving his brothers and his family from starving to death. And so once again, we can see the folly and the sin of Abraham's family is met with God's faithfulness, who subverts even the evil of the brothers into an occasion to save life. And this is actually what Joseph says right near the end of the book. He says to his brothers, you all planned this for evil, but God planned it for good, to save many lives. Now, these words are strategically placed at the end of the book because they summarize not only the story of Joseph and his brothers, but the book as a whole. From Genesis 3 onward, humans keep acting selfishly and doing evil, but this God is not going to leave his world to its own devices. He remains faithful and determined to bless people despite their failures. You can see this especially in that mysterious promise about the descendant of the woman gets developed throughout the book. So remember, Genesis 3, God promised that this wounded victor would come and crush the snake and defeat evil at its source. And the author then connects this promise directly to the line of Abraham. This is a part of how God's going to bring his blessing to the nation. Now from Abraham, this promise gets connected to Judah, the 4th son of Jacob. And this is how. In an extremely important poem in chapter 49, an aging Jacob, he's on his deathbed, he wants to bless his 12 sons. And when he comes to Judah, Jacob predicts that Judah will become the tribe of Israel's royal leaders, and that one day a king will come who will command the obedience of all the nations and fulfill God's promise to restore the garden blessing to all of the world. And then after this, Jacob dies. And later Joseph dies too. And the growing family remains in Egypt. And so the book of Genesis ends with all of these future hopes and promises left hanging and undeveloped. And it forces you to turn the page to see how it's all going to turn out. But for now, that's the book of Genesis.
Okay, so lots to cover, a lot going on in that video. But here's where we're going to start. We're starting where our genealogy left off last time. So we did the Noah's Ark story. Noah's sons were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we've been following this line of that seed that was promised in Genesis, right? The 3:15 that it was talking about in this video. We're following this line to get to Jesus. And so from Shem, we've got 8 generations that get us to Abram, as he is known at the beginning of the story. He will later become Abraham. But Abram is a direct descendant of Shem, who is Noah's son. And we'll fill more of this in later. Sarai is his wife. She is his wife when the story begins. Hagar is her maidservant, and she will come into play in a little bit. That's why she's got the dotted lines, because she's not officially married to him, but she does play an important role. All right, everybody got this? They filled in their things they want to. All right, so let's jump into Abram's story. And this is where we're going to spend most of our time talking today, though we will get into a little bit of Isaac and Jacob, and we'll see where this goes. All right, so let's go to Genesis 12 and read 1 through 3. Whoever wants to read that.
12, 1 through 3.
12, 1 through 3.
Call Abram. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your nation country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you, and I curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you.
Thank you. Okay, so in these first 3 verses, we are getting a ton of information that we're going to see played out through the rest of the story of Abraham. And just to give you guys the background on where Abram is currently at in this story. So we saw the people of Babylon scattered, right? And out of that scattering of people, God has chosen this one family he's going to focus in on. And particularly Abram is going to be his guy. So in chapter 11, right before this, we see that Abram's family, his extended family, is originally from this land of Ur. By the time the story starts, we're up here at number 2, and his family and his dad and his wife and nephew are all living in this area of Haran. So when God calls Abram, he is calling him out of this land of Haran down into number 3, which is the promised land. This is a land that we are going to see become a thing again and again and again. This is the land that Israelites are trying to get back to from the Exodus. Here, this is the land of Canaan. So this is where we're going to. So God wants Abram to come out of Haran and into Canaan. Now, this is not like asking a person just to hey, I want you to move your tent from here to here. He is asking Abram to give up his entire life that he has built in this land of Haran. He has to leave behind his family. He takes his wife, he takes his nephew, which proves to be a little bit complicated later on. He probably shouldn't have done that, but his wife goes with him. But he has to leave the rest of his family. He has to leave his father. And more importantly, he has to leave the gods that are part of this land of Haran. So back in ancient Mesopotamia, where you lived determined what gods you worshipped. And each city, town, village, whatever you want to call them, had their own kind of specific gods that they built. Things like those ziggurats that we saw in the last chapter 2. Those were pretty common. And then if there wasn't that kind of thing, they had some kind of altar to them in their towns. So when you left your city, a big part of interacting with those gods during this time was you had to go and make sacrifices, and you had to be in that present space. So if you left the city, you left the gods that you were worshiping as well. And wherever you went, you picked up those gods that already had a temple or an altar there. So God, our God, Yahweh, is calling Abram out of this land of Haran, out of this land of whatever gods they worship there, into the new space that he wants him to be in. So again, it's a big deal. So we are setting up something where God has separated Abram and Sarai out from everybody else that he knows. And that's going to be a theme, again, that we see playing out again and again, as this separating out God's chosen people. Okay? So right after that, we see that God makes 3 sort of statements to Abram about what he's going to do for him. He says that he's going to make him a great nation, that he's going to he's going to grow his family, use his family to bless others, and that he is going to basically curse anybody who does Abram wrong. And these three promises we're going to see playing out through Abram's story, especially when we get to the covenant part. But we're also going to see that last one where he's going to punish people who go against Abram play out really quickly in these next few verses. So we've set our stage here. We've got Abram. Now somebody please tell me why God chooses Abram. Anybody?
You can use your words.
It's a trick question. We don't know.
We don't know?
We don't know. Yeah. It doesn't say. It doesn't say. And it's not because, so like when God picks Noah, right, when we read the story of Noah in the ark, it specifically says that God picks Noah because he found favor in God's eyes, because he was righteous. It does not say that about Abram. And that's important because we are not starting with somebody who God has already deemed to be righteous in some way. Why God picks Abram specifically, we don't know. We will see that God stays faithful and loyal to his choices. And so, despite there many, many flaws. So Abram's first character flaw is going to show up just a few verses down. So let's go to Genesis 12 and read 12:10 through 19. To the rest of that chapter. Abram and Sarai and Egypt.
I can. So, at that time, a severe famine struck the land.
Famine.
Famine.
Severe famine, not a severe family.
At that time, a severe famine struck the land of Canaan, forcing Abram to go down to Egypt, where he lived as a foreigner. As he was approaching the border of Egypt, Abram said to his wife Sarah, "Look, you are a very beautiful woman. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife. Let's kill him, then we can have her. So please tell them that you are my sister. Then they will spare my life and treat me well because of their interest in you.'" And sure enough, when Abram arrived in Egypt, everyone noticed Sarah's beauty. When the palace officials saw her, they sung her praises to Pharaoh, their king, and Sarah was taken into his palace. Then Pharaoh gave Abram many gifts because of her: sheep, goats, cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and animals. But the Lord sent terrible plagues upon Pharaoh and his household because of Sarah, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh summoned Abram and accused him sharply. "What have you done to me?" he demanded. Why did you tell me she was your wife? Why didn't you say she is my sister and allow me to take her as my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and get out of here." Pharaoh ordered some of his men to escort them, and he sent Abram out of the country, along with his wife and all his possessions.
Thank you. All right. So here we go. Here is our first real glimpse at Abram's character. And what is it that he does in this story?
He tries deceiving the people.
Okay. He does something kind of deceptive, right? And what is it that he does?
He tells Sarai to lie to the Egyptians and say that she is his sister.
So they get to this land. So right in verse 12, the very beginning, right? God has asked Abram to move into this new land of Canaan. In verse 10, we find out that Canaan has a severe famine. So what does Abram do? He leaves the land. God has asked him to come into this land. As soon as a problem strikes up, Abram's like, "I'm out of here. I'm going to Egypt." And this is where we see problems start to arrive, because here we are. Abram's walking away from that plan that God had for him. And so we're going to see some of Abram's character issues, and we're going to see some issues that God has to deal with because of Abraham's choices here. So God told him to stay in the land. He's leaving the land. And when he gets to Egypt, like Cain said, he tries to pass Sarah off as his sister because she's beautiful, and because it was not uncommon in this time for the rulers of lands to take their pick of women. And if a beautiful one came in, whether she was married or not, I mean, we even see this with David later on in the Bible, right? If you're the ruler, you get to pick. And so because Sarah is so beautiful, Abram knows going into this that there's going to be trouble here. And if they know that they're married, they're just going to kill Abram. So he tells Sarah to pretend to be his sister, which is kind of a half-truth because she actually is his half-sister, which I know. There's a lot of fun connections in the Old Testament. But so she is his sister. So he does ask her to play up that aspect and play down the fact that she is his wife. And so what do we see happening from that? This deception that Abram tries to pull.
A lie.
Yeah, so it's a lie. But what does God do here? How does God step in and fix this situation that got him and Sarah in?
Kicks them out of Egypt.
Okay, he finds a way for them to get out of Egypt, right? What does he do to Pharaoh?
Because Pharaoh has his wife, slash sister, I guess, he brings bad things upon Pharaoh.
Yes. What specifically does he bring? Look at verse 17.
The blood, river red.
Well, that comes later. What does it say in verse 17 that he brings? You're on the right track. But I think Logan said it. Logan, did you say it? What is it that he brings? Plagues. So we know, if you know, maybe you know, hopefully you know, coming up very soon, we're going to have another story that involves Pharaoh and some plagues, right? So right now we're getting a little bit of foreshadowing about where that's going. And we're going to see the Israelites, kind of their story gets brought up again here not too long from here. All right, so Abraham has wandered off God's plan like almost immediately. And God has to come in and he has to fix the situation because he has chosen Abraham. And this is important. Abraham's going to make a lot of mistakes. In fact, all the guys that we talk about today are going to make a lot of mistakes. And it's going to be like, why didn't God pick somebody better than this to be his person, right? And here's what we need to recognize right off the bat, that God is faithful. We know that from the first part of Genesis. He's going to stay loyal to his choices. And his choice is Abraham, so he's sticking with him. And so he sends in these plagues. He gets Abram and Sarah out of this situation they've gotten themselves to, and they get back to the land. So they leave and go back to the land. And what follows after that is we get a few stories about Abram and his nephew Lot, who they end up having to kind of split up because there's not enough resources in the land of Canaan for both of them to kind of grow their families and their flocks. So Lot goes off to the area around Sodom and Gomorrah. We get that story, which we're not going to get into today because that's going to open up a ton of can of worms that we're not getting into. But we do see that Abram becomes sort of like this sole inheritor of the land of Canaan after Lot goes off to this territory around Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, that's important because God's original command to Abram was to leave his family. So Lot was a bit of an obstacle because he brought Lot with him. And Lot, as a male descendant, would have been, a part of this blessing. But so now God has made it a way for Lot to move out of this land, and it's just Abram's land now. Okay, so that is what sets us up for this covenant that Abram is going to, or that God is going to establish with Abraham. We'll take a break in like 5. How you guys doing? We okay? We doing good? Okay. Let's go through the covenant, and then we'll take a break for like 5 minutes. You can get water or more food or whatever, and then we'll regroup from there. But let's read Genesis 15, 1 through 21. This is our big covenant, the Abrahamic covenant.
Oh. That does not remind me of the French Revolution at all.
All right. Let's read 15 and you won't be confused. Somebody read 15 for us. I should have waited until that was, we had read that. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Anybody? Who's our readers? Come on. Okay. Anthony, yours. Oh, you both have read. Who else? We've got more readers. Kylie, you're a reader. Read for us. Chapter 15.
Sometime later the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great." But Abram replied, "O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir." Then the Lord said to him, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Then the Lord told him, I'm the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession. Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it? The Lord told him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So Abram presented all these to him and killed them. Then he cut each animal down the middle and laid the halves side by side. He did not, however, cut the birds in half. Some vultures swooped down to eat the carcasses, but Abram chased them away. As the sun was going down, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a terrifying darkness came down over him. Then the Lord said to Abram, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end they will come away with great wealth. As for you, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. After 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. After the sun went down and darkness fell, Abram saw a smoking firepot and a flaming torch pass between the halves of the carcasses. So the Lord made a covenant with Abram that day and said, I have given this land to your descendants, all the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River. The land now occupied by the...
Yeah, we got a bunch of names there. You can skip those. So, interestingly, all these people that are listed at the end, these are descendants of the people that we saw from the last section. The Canaanites are the descendants of Cain. And as we move forward through the Bible, you'll find that all of these guys that we end up having problems with, the Canaanites, the Amorites, they are all just descendants of Noah and Abraham. So we're all kind of related in some way. Okay, a lot going on in this chapter. We've got God establishing his second covenant in the Bible. And this one is very different from the one with Noah, right? We've got a lot of things happening here that we did not see happening with Noah. One thing I want to point out is that right away, we still have Abram who is questioning how God is going to fulfill any of these promises to him. He knows his wife Sarah is barren, and so he can't figure out how he's going to be a father of nations if his wife can't have any children. So he's like, well, I guess I'm going to have to leave all my inheritance to my servant, which was a pretty common practice in ancient Mesopotamia. Abram's already trying to figure out how he is going to manipulate God's promises in the way that makes sense to him, right? I don't see a way for my wife to get pregnant, so this is obviously what you're going to do. And God says, no. They're actually going to come from you. It's not going to be a servant who's not related to you. They're going to be they're going to number the stars in the heaven. And so then he makes this covenant promise with him. And this is where we get some very weird stuff happening. And this is a neat little illustration that I found online that sort of shows us exactly what this would have looked like. So God tells Abram to go and find a bunch of animals, cut them in half, kind of make a path in between them that's filled with blood. And this is how this covenant is going to come into effect. Now, again, very different from Noah, but this is also a different kind of covenant. This is what we call a blood covenant. This is important because we also know that who else was a blood covenant? Jesus. So here's where we get sort of our first sort of glimpses of the idea that blood matters, right? We talked about this when I did my Christianity 101, how blood is the life force, is what God calls for in certain situations. And here we have a prime example of it. So what happens in this story, Abram cuts up the animals, and in a typical covenant, what would happen, so this was not just how God does his covenants, this was typical of how covenants worked amongst neighbors, amongst relatives, whoever you were making a covenant with, a blood covenant anyway. And both parties would walk through the middle of these animals, of these dead animals. And the idea was that when you walk through the middle of these animals, you were basically taking responsibility for the outcome of the covenant. If you failed to uphold your side, then what happened to those animals was going to happen to you, right? So you didn't want to do that. It was very symbolic. But what does he do? What does he do to Abram? So, like I said, typical covenant, both parties would walk through the middle of these animals. But look at, where is it? Where does it say you put him to sleep? Oh, verse 12. Look at verse 12. Yes, Kane.
Abram fell into a deep sleep.
Yes, he puts him into a deep sleep, which means that Abram cannot walk through the middle of these animals. But when Abram wakes up a little bit later, he sees this torch, this flame, going through the middle. And this is God. This is God walking through the middle of these animals. So God doesn't let Abram walk through the middle of the covenant. Why?
Because he's gonna break it.
Okay, maybe.
I feel like that's a trick question again.
I think it's a trick question. So if you were establishing a covenant with somebody and you're both supposed to take on the responsibility of the outcome of this covenant, and then you knocked the other person out so they couldn't, and you walked through the middle instead, what would be your reasoning to do that? Brenna?
You're taking responsibility, like God was taking responsibility for Abraham.
Yes. Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, that's exactly what's happening here. Okay? God is not establishing this covenant with Abram because he is expecting Abram to be completely faithful to this thing. In fact, he knows that he can't. God has not been duped by people over and over again. He has learned that people are going to fail, right? So God is taking the full responsibility of this covenant onto himself. So if this covenant does not play itself out, God is basically annihilating himself in some way. And I don't know how that works, but that's basically what he is symbolizing here, is that all the weight of the responsibility of this covenant is on God. It's not on Abram, and thank goodness, because Abram continues to be a bit of a schmuck as we go forward. But, so we've established this covenant. It's our blood covenant, and we've got a whole new ball game going on here. So all those things that God told Abram he was going to do, he's going to make him a great nation, he's going to give him lots of children, and those people are going to be a blessing to all nations. That is what this covenant is all about. God is making a promise to Abram that that seed that we talked about in Genesis 3:15 is going to come from Abram. And as we will see, who is that seed? Jesus. Good job, guys. All right, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and hop into Isaac.
That is a very gruesome
It is, right? Very gruesome. Whoop, whoop, whoop.
Sorry, I was waiting for my bag.
I've seen worse.
I mean, if you're into hunting, it's not that bad, right? Okay so far?
Yep.
We're not going to get everything done, but that's okay.
Yeah. I think I'm gonna head out a lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Do we know how to turn everything off?
I'm gonna check with Anthony right now. That'd be good.
Okay.
I've got the recording on here.
It was like, this should go viral.
Yeah.
People are being so active in this.
Take the batteries out of the book.
It's like,
Yeah.
Next Monday I have to get up there to go to the airport. So I have to come up there. Let us know. I'm playing that in Thursday.
Yeah, I know. It's the next thing.
That part.
Do we know we say hey?
Oh.
All right.
Okay.
Good luck.
Good luck.
Bye, Cody.
Your what hurts?
Oh, your feet hurt. Because like you're trying.
Good luck. Sorry, there's no
You have to do blood because like blood means life, and if like there were like a monetary value means like nothing to God. So.
It's Well, it's funny sometimes when you're things like, I'm like, I've heard these things several times. But some stuff has not stood out to me, like, it didn't resonate.
Yeah.
And, I'm going to go on a long talk with my Bible teachers that used to come to our school. Because they totally never talk about Abraham as being a father. Never described him that way.
A little bit. Little bit. That's all
Like,
right.
I can't handle people chewing on something. Like, I can't handle people chewing on pens or pencils. That's just wrong. It's in the way. So, like,
Okay,
can't look at you.
to God, girl, in the photo you pocket.
Can I look at it?
It's all right. Abraham gets his nice redeeming moment coming up pretty soon, so he loses his schmuck status.
Because I read it from last year too. It was like, I don't even remember the part, but I knew you could sleep. So I just spoke, I was like, yeah, I remember my candle. And I was like,
Wait,
somehow that's not the part that resonated.
Yeah. I mean, I think unless somebody like explains how the way the covenants are supposed to work, you wouldn't read it as being, she's like, oh, that's a weird thing God decided to do. But like, when you know that means that he can't, you know, even try to pledge to fulfill his end of the covenant, that God's taking the whole responsibility, that it makes it more like, okay, there's no way this can fail, sort of a situation. What happened to Tyler?
For me, like, as I read through, or the thing that always stuck out to me, from me, like, this is how they got the name Hebrew, is because it means wanderer.
Yeah, I think Abraham's the first one that's called the Hebrew, right? Yeah.
Hebrew. And that they, what also happened is they were the first people that took their God with them, because everywhere else.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why the Ark of the Covenant is so important, is because you just left them behind before.
Yes, and that's why you over an area, okay, that means this God's not there anymore. We take it, it was expanded their land, they assumed it's because, you know, whatever God that was in the area, and
Yeah.
their control expanded.
Yeah.
Their God got to control that land, whereas that God was inside that land. That was the part when I read the story that I was like, oh, that's good.
Yeah, that's cool, huh? It's like, oh, it's all, there's so much intent behind all of it. It's kind of mind blowing. All right. While, no, I'm good. We good? Everybody back? Is this everybody?
Everyone's back.
Kane's here. Okay, a couple of just real quick things I want to point out also about this chapter 15. Like I said, we had some foreshadowing into the Israelites and their interactions with Pharaoh. They're coming up in our next session in Exodus. And here we see God specifically calling that out. So in verse 13, he says, Then the Lord said to Abram, You can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land. This is when they're in Egypt. There they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. God is telling us what is about to happen in this story. So again, here's our big theme. God is fully aware of what's going to happen. He knows how all this is going to play out. None of it is beyond his control. And even though our people who are, you know, our seeds of our faith going on here may mess up every now and then, God's going to right it every single time. And this is our Old Testament theme all the way till we get to Jesus. God's going to find a plan to right things for us, okay? So the next thing that happens right after this covenant, so we said Sarah's barren. That hasn't changed yet. Abram is not sure where his descendants are coming from. And so here we have Abram again. This is in the next chapter, chapter 16, with the birth of Ishmael. We have Abram again saying, I'm going to take control of this situation. God obviously doesn't have this figured out, so him and Sarah come up with this like scheme, not really scheme, this is pretty common practice back in the day, hang on just a second, that Sarah is going to give Abram her maidservant Hagar, and that is how they are going to produce a child. So, you know, like however we're going to get a child is how we're going to get a child, and this is how Abram and Sarah have decided the means of that going to happen. Yes?
this guy never learns his lessons.
Yes. That is also a theme of the Bible. Yes, Will.
How did that work out for him?
Okay, good. How does this work out for him? So Ishmael is born, and Abram, here's something we need to make sure very clear, because I think a lot of times when we talk about Ishmael, we're just like, oh, that kid, that wasn't supposed to happen. Abram loved Ishmael, you guys, and him and Sarah and Hagar, they believed Ishmael to be that covenantal heir. They thought they had figured this out, And so they're riding this wave. Like, this is our guy, this is our kid. And so up until he's about 13 years old, this is like what they think the plan is. So Ishmael is not treated like a, leftover kid or whatever. I mean, he's embraced by Abram. Sarah and Hagar don't get along very well, and that causes some issues. But Ishmael in and of himself is not necessarily problematic. Here's something that I think is just super cool that I want to point out. So Ishmael's born. Sarah and Hagar get into a tiff because now we've got some like competing for affection and who's the dominant woman in this group. And so there's some stuff there that happens between them that doesn't set up for anything good later on. But before we get into any of that, we have this section where God gives us the sign of the covenant. So if you remember from our Noahic covenant, what was the sign of that covenant?
Rainbow.
The rainbow, yes. So God destroys the earth with water, wipes everybody out, and the sign that he's not going to do that again is the rainbow in the sky. So in the next couple of chapters, we see God is establishing a sign of this covenant that he has just made with Abraham. That covenant is circumcision, which is not as fun as the rainbow, but that is what he decides that for various reasons that I'm not going to go into. That's why God decides that the sign for this covenant is. But while he's giving Abraham this information that this is what the sign is going to be, he also changes Abram and Sarai's name. And I think this is so cool, and this is why this really is just an extraneous fact. So I'm going to go over here so I can point this out to you guys. Okay, so again, this is our God's name, right? Yahweh. This is his proper name. When you see in your Bible, Lord in all capital letters, these are the Hebrew, this is not Hebrew, this is English, but the Hebrew letters that correlate with these are what's there. There's no vowels in Hebrew, so it's just YH, WH, and we put the vowels in, pronounce it Yahweh, we can actually say it. In Hebrew, this is what it looks like. These are our H's, right? H's in the Hebrew language represent like the breath of life. And so God's name is basically made out of the symbols that equal the breath of life. Where would that come from? Genesis, right? Where we see him giving everybody the breath of life. Okay. So these are our like main characters in Yahweh's name. When he changes Abram's name to Abraham, Sarai's name to Sarah, look at what he's adding to their names. Yes, he's adding that dominant character from his own name into their names. Now, this was also kind of a key component of Old Covenants, was that when you established the covenant, both of you walked through the animals, you exchanged part of your names. So it's like you were becoming one. Here, so obviously Abraham and Sarah, again, they are the recipients of this covenant. They are not, God's not depending on them to give anything back, so they don't give him part of their names, but he gives them part of his name, which I think is just super cool. Kind of a nerdy thing. But basically, God inserts his name into Abraham and Sarah's name, and that's how why we start referring to them as Abraham and Sarah and not Abram and Sarai. All right. Moving forward. Okay.
Finally decided to show up.
All right, let's jump back in Genesis 18, and we get a son is promised to Sarah. We're going to read chapter 18 up through verse 15. So can you maybe read 18, 1 through 15 for me, please? Come on, somebody read it. I know you're all tired of hearing my voice. Maddie, will you read it for us?
The Lord appeared again to Abraham near the oak grove belonging to
Mamre. Mm-hmm.
One day, Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent during the hottest part of the day. He looked up and noticed 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he ran to meet them and welcomed them, bowing low to the ground. "My lord," he said, "if it pleases you, stop here for a while. Rest in the shade of this tree while water is brought to wash your feet. And since you've honored your servant with this visit, let me prepare some food to refresh you before you continue on your journey." "All right," they said, "do as they have said." So Abraham ran to the tent and said to Sarah, "Hurry, get 3 large measures of your best flour, knead it into dough, and bake some bread." Then Abraham ran out to the herd and chose a tender calf and gave it to his servant, who quickly prepared it. When the food was ready, Abraham took some yogurt and milk and the roasted meat, and he served it to the men. As they ate, Abraham waited on them in the shade of the trees. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" the visitors asked. "She's inside the tent," Abraham replied. Then one of them said, I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son. Sarah was listening to this conversation from the tent. Abraham and Sarah were both very old by this time, and Sarah was long past the age of having children. So she laughed silently to herself and said, how could a worn-out woman like me enjoy such pleasure, especially when my master, my husband, is also so old? And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, can an old woman like me have a baby? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she denied it, saying, I didn't laugh. But the Lord said, no, you did laugh.
You did laugh. What's funny is, do you know what the name Isaac means? It means laughing. So I like how the names always have a connection here.
Question.
Yes, dear.
Everything she does,
Mhm.
comes a name for our next son.
Well, she only has, yeah, no. I don't know that we see that anywhere else, but I do think it's funny how sometimes these names get correlated to the way the people have behaved or something like that. Okay, so lots happening in this part of the story too. So, like I said, up until this point, Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, they've all believed that Ishmael is that chosen covenantal heir. He is who the seed to Jesus is going to go through. Then we find out in this chapter it's not Ishmael, right? Because Sarah is going to be this covenantal heir's mother. At this point, they're both real old, and they don't understand how this is going to happen. Because again, I said we've got two people who really like to take control of the reins here, and they're not seeing how this is going to play out. So God steps in. He sends these three men, or what does it say they've been? Yes, three men standing nearby. So the reason I wanted us to read this, because this is something I'm going to point out to you guys that I think is really interesting, and you can decide for yourselves how you feel about this. This isn't like a set in stone theology principle. But there is a Christological approach to reading the Old Testament. And what that means is that anytime you see God talking to someone as a man, so sometimes he's called the angel of Lord. In this situation, we get these three men who show up. One of them, who gets referred to as the Lord later in the story, is speaking directly to Abraham and Sarah. That you can read that as being Jesus. Okay, so now obviously Old Testament wise, they would not have understood that to be the case because they weren't connecting the dots. They didn't have that hindsight thing going on. But that is a very popular and rational approach to reading anytime that God appears as in the form of a man, even in the Old Testament, that you are seeing Jesus showing up there. And we'll see this happen again with the story of Jacob when he wrestles the guy.
That's kind of spooky.
It's interesting though, right? Because again, the whole point of this class is this is all pointing to Jesus. Mm-hmm. Now, again, Old Testament people would not have recognized that to be Jesus because they didn't have any understanding of where this story was going, but we do. And so we can look back into that and read back into that. Now, again, not everybody buys into this, and you can decide for yourself. If it's something that interests you, like research it, because there's lots of times in the Old Testament that this shows up. And I think it's a pretty cool idea because we do know that God as a man is Jesus. So presumably if God had showed up any other time in the Bible as a man, also Jesus. All right. And we see in this, I think you see a little bit of Jesus's compassionate nature showing up in this, where like gently rebuking Sarah for laughing, but it's not like I'm going to smite you dead because you laughed. Like we see a lot of grace that's happening here with Sarah, even though she's like, I don't know what's happening. Okay. So this is how we get to Isaac. We're going to skip over all this Sodom and Gomorrah. If you're interested in Sodom and Gomorrah, go ahead and read it, but it's going to open up a whole can of worms, yeah.
So, verse 15.
Yeah.
When it says Sarah was afraid, so she denied it, saying,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't laugh.
Yes.
But the Lord said,
No, you
no,
did laugh.
did laugh.
Yeah.
I can kind of see that being like a kind of snarky remark, but more like funny. Like,
yeah.
no.
No, you did.
laugh.
You did it. I heard you. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, and you'll see throughout the Old Testament that sometimes somebody will do something silly like that, and God will strike them dead right there. But here, because again, God has promised to Abraham and Sarah that they are His people, that He's going to get this line through. We get a lot of grace for Sarah in this moment, even though her faith is questionable here. All right, we're not going to get through half of what I wanted to get through, but that's okay, because we're having some good conversations, and I want to make sure we have time. There's one more part that I want to get through before we stop and just do questions and talk about what we learned, okay? Because I know I've been talking at you guys a lot. this Abraham story is dense, and most of it's pretty important. Okay, Isaac is born, and we now know that Isaac is the covenantal heir, right? And so now we've got Ishmael, he's a teenager at this point, and he is not the heir. So what we're going to see happen is this is where, because Abraham tried to take matters into his own hands, some problems are going to arise. Sarah sees Ishmael sort of like messing with Isaac, and it like makes her mama bear comes out, and she demands that Abram kick Hagar and Ishmael out of their little tent community, to send them off into the wilderness. Abraham, not being the amazing leader that he is, says, okay, fine. She's in the way, we're going to send them off. And so Hagar and Ishmael get sent off into the wilderness. It looks like they're going to die. In fact, they come like pretty close to it. And then God intervenes, and he actually ends up blessing Ishmael. And he's saying that Ishmael will also be a leader of great nations. And so here's what I want you to keep in mind. So Abraham has been giving this covenantal blessing that he is going to be the father of great nations. Israel is just one of those nations. Israel is going to be the nation that we follow through the rest of the Old Testament. But Israel is not the only nation that Abraham is the father of. So Ishmael goes off, and he makes descendants. He also has a wife after Sarah that he has children with that also go off to become some of these like ites that we see people battling later down the line. But there are nations that are coming out of Abraham that aren't Israel. Now, Israel is our seed. It's our seed that's getting us to Jesus. But there are other people out there, and God has he blesses Ishmael and says he's going to be a great nation. Here's an interesting fact. It is believed that Islam, the religion of Islam, comes from Ishmael. So that he is the forefather of Islam, and that you can trace his descendants back, or his descendants down to Muhammad and that whole thing. Now, I just think that's interesting that Abraham is also considered the forefather of Islam as well as Christianity. Just a little trivia fact for you there. Okay, but that's where that comes from. It's interesting. I know. So here is where we get Abraham's chance to redeem himself. He's made some not great decisions. And in chapter 22, we're going to get Abraham's faith tested. We're going to read this whole chapter. So 22, 1 through 20, this is the last part we're going to read, and then we'll take questions. Anybody want to read that for us?
Where are we at?
22, the whole chapter. Mm-hmm. 22, Genesis 22.
Garrett really likes to read.
Garrett needs to read, yes.
Oh, your mom just called you out. Do you know what? I think
Don't be calling people out.
you could also call your mom out, Garrett, if you want to. Leaders are perfectly allowed to read if they so choose.
Yeah, I'll read.
Okay, go for it, Jillian.
What page is it?
It's page 17, 20, all of 22, Genesis 22.
Genesis 22?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Mom.
I'll take it.
You owe her.
So sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. Abraham, God called. Yes, he replied, here I am. Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you. The next morning, Abraham got up early. He saddled his donkey and took 2 of his servants with him, along with his son, Isaac. Then he chopped wood for a fire for a burnt offering, set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day of their journey, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Stay here with the donkey, Abraham told the servants. The boy and I will travel a little farther. We will worship there, and then we will come right back. So Abraham placed the wood for the burnt offering on Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them walked out together, Isaac turned to Abraham and said, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. We have the fire and the wood, the boy said. But where is the sheep for the burnt offering? God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son, Abraham answered, and they both walked on together. When they arrived at the place where God had told them to go, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. Then he tied his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. At that moment, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Yes, Abraham replied, here I am. Don't lay a hand on the boy, the angel said. Do not hurt him in any way, for now I know that you truly fear God. You have not only withheld from me even your son, your only son. Then Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. So he took the ram and sacrificed as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham named the place Yahweh Yireh, which means the Lord will provide. To this day, people still use that name as a proverb. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Then the angel of the Lord called again to Abraham from heaven. This is what the Lord says, because you have obeyed me and have not withheld even your son, your only son, I swear by my own name that I will certainly bless you. I will multiply your descendants beyond number, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will conquer the cities of their enemies, and through your descendants all the nations of the earth will be blessed, and all because you obeyed me. Then they returned to the servants and traveled back to Beersheba, where Abraham continued to live. Soon after this, Abraham heard that Milcah, his brother Nahor's wife, had borne Nahor 8 sons. The oldest was named Uz, the next oldest was Buz, followed by Kemuel, the ancestor of Armaeans, Kesad, Hazo, Pildash.
You don't have to read all this.
Shua became the father of Rebekah. In addition to these 8 sons from Milcah, Nahor had 4 other children from his concubine Reumah. Their names were Tibah, Gaham, Tahash, and Makkah.
Oh, thank you, Joe. So the interesting thing about this last part is the name Rebecca. She will show up later when we get to Isaac. That will be his wife. Okay. Rest of this, though, well, we've already gotten to Isaac, but she will be his wife eventually. So what is happening in this chapter?
Oh, it's not the first part. Abraham is being commanded as a test of faith
Okay, good.
from God to sacrifice his son.
Sacrifice Isaac.
Sorry. And like I said, it's a test of faith because Abraham keeps going his own ways and God still has faith in him.
Good. Okay, yeah. So we know from the title, test of faith, right? But why would God even ask Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, right? Who we know is the covenantal heir. We've been told this. So if Abraham kills Isaac, what happens to the covenant?
It's broken.
It's broken, right? Why? So what is this about? Like, why would he even ask Abraham to do this?
Proving his loyalty to God.
Good. Yeah. What is the one thing that we have seen Abraham do this whole story?
Be disloyal.
Be disloyal and to like try and take that control, right? To come up with some. Yeah. Go ahead.
That's what's driving me nuts about this story. Is it doesn't say at all like he even hesitated. He just went, oh, okay, God wants me to kill my son now, my only actual heir. It's the only time he seems to have not actually hesitated.
Right.
Do the dishes.
And while if you're just reading this story out of context, you're like, man, Abraham is a terrible father, right? Like he doesn't even pause. But if you're reading it in the context of all of these other things that have led us to this place where Abraham has continually questioned God, questioned how God's going to provide, like hasn't like figured it out, right? And now we're in this space where God tells Abraham to do something crazy. He tells him to go and sacrifice his son, and Abraham doesn't skip a beat. All right, this is where we see Abraham's faith, like really like, here we are. This is how we get to the founding father of our faith as like sort of that like, you know, the guy that we like to think of him as, is because we have an act here where Abraham is willing to put Isaac, and it's not just he's willing to put his son on the altar. He is willing to put the covenant on the altar. So all of these blessings that God has promised him, Abraham is trusting that even if he has to go through with this and kill Isaac, that God has another plan in store, that God will stay faithful to this covenant, and it will play out the way it's supposed to. And that is not something that we have seen from Abraham up until this point. So this is a huge character moment for Abraham. And yeah, it's very tempting to read it like world's worst dad. But if you understand this to be, like Cain said, a test of faith, you know, and I think you could like debate all day about whether Abraham really thought he was going to have to kill Isaac or not. But the point is that he was going to do it if he had to. And then we see God being like, nope, we're good. I just needed to make sure that you were all in this. Okay, so that gets us up to Isaac. And Isaac doesn't do a whole lot after this story, other than we have a story about him finding his wife Rebecca through a servant. There's not a lot that happens up until Jacob. So we will, at our next session, we'll start in with Jacob and talk about the Israelites a little bit from there. But let's go over we'll get back to all that later. Let's get back to our 5 questions. Okay. So we're going to answer these 5 questions in terms of the entire Abraham story. From Abraham's call to Abraham willing to sacrifice Isaac on all. So can somebody tell me, just like very briefly, what is the story of Abraham? What's happening in the story?
I'm going to take my hand down for that one. I can explain things briefly.
Okay, fair enough. Anybody else? Anthony.
I think it's just like the story of just like this man who was like appointed by God, and it kind of like represents like humanity in a way.
Yes.
Where he's being taken through like these multiple places where God is promising him that He will give him this stuff, but because like the man can be like so narrow-minded that he decides to take control in his own hands, but because of that starts going in like ways that like is undesirable to the man. So it's up to God to like bring him back to where they were originally going to go. And so like once he's like finally like accepting, like once he's like, all right, God, I'm gonna leave this to you now by like offering his son to like get stabbied. So once he like does that, once he's like putting up to like offer like this thing that like he has been promised for so long, that just kind of shows that like he now like trusts in God more with like he's like I understand I'm not in control of this.
Yes.
So this is for you now.
Very good. Thank you, Anthony. That was perfect. Yes. Go for it. What are you doing? What's happening?
At least somebody knows sign language.
Yep, not me. Okay. Okay, good. Yeah, that was a great what's happening. Okay, so where are we in the Bible timeline? We are right after Genesis. We are still in Genesis. We are right after the creation, right after Noah's Ark. And we have now God has established his relationship with this one family. And this is our family, guys. This is who we are following from here till we get to Jesus. These are our people. Okay? What does this story tell us about human nature? I think Anthony did a pretty decent job of explaining how Abraham stands in for humanity in these stories in a lot of ways, and how we're all prone to trying to take control out of God's hands. And even when God says, hey, this is what I'm going to do, when we don't see how it's going to work out, we try to make our own paths. So let's just go ahead and jump to 4. And what does this tell us about God's nature? Well,
He is extremely patient.
That's good. I'm going to add that to our list of here. This is my list of, oops.
If my sister did it that many times, I'll probably yell at her right about now.
He is extremely patient. These are the characteristics that we kind of talked about last time. So I'm going to kind of add to these when we come up with what we know about God's. Anything else? What else does it tell us about God's nature? We know, he's super patient. What else is he? Like, what else are we seeing in God here?
He gives second chances.
He gives second chances. He's compassionate,
He
right?
gives second
He's
chances.
merciful.
Yes.
Yes. Good. Merciful. Is that how you spell merciful? Let's see. Yes. Okay, good. And we also see sort of them doubling down on this idea of God's faithfulness, right? His loyalty to his choices. He doesn't abandon Abraham as soon as Abraham turns out to not be the stand-up guy we all hoped he would be at the beginning. Like, he sticks with him and he fixes this problem. That's what we're going to see to be a very, very important characteristic of God, one that he, in Exodus, will proclaim about himself, because his faithfulness and his loyalty, this line, this family, are critical. If God is not faithful to this covenant with Abraham, we do not get to Jesus. We do not get to salvation. All of this is critical in getting us to that part of the story. Which leads us to our next question, which I'm not on the right thing for.
Why he picked Abraham.
How does this story get us to Jesus?
We like in the story itself, like when like Isaac and like Abraham were doing their thing, the big thing that stuck out to me was like just the parallels to the story of like God and Jesus in general.
Right, sacrificing
like,
the son,
all that
right?
Stuff, like the wood on his back.
Sure, there's a lot of yes.
And just like even just like the ram, just like because like the ram is like just kind of there to be sacrificed later on, so that like being like the lamb and just like the ram being there.
No, those are good.
Connected.
Those are good. So Jolene's got her hand up.
You know what I'm excited about?
Say it, Jolene.
So, that mountain he went on, that's where Jesus was crucified. That's where where the Romans set up the crosses and had them crucified.
What?
Did I just blow your mind?
So
Yes.
this land, and that was something that I should have mentioned to you guys before. This,
No, I think it's better when it comes up at the end because you're like, what? Those things give you goosebumps.
this land that we're in, this land of Canaan, this is Jerusalem. This is modern Israel is right here. This is the land that we stay in for the rest of the Bible, basically. So
add like storytellers.
it's pretty cool, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there, the Bible has all kinds of Easter eggs in it, guys. And if you're willing to take the time to search them out, it will blow your mind. If you are willing to go through all the Marvel movies and find all the connections, you should be able to really go through the Bible and find them too. Okay, we're out of time. If anybody has any really pressing questions, we can take like one or two, or you can stay after. I know we covered a lot. Yeah, Will.
Was it good that you took the ram and stuff and it wasn't bad? That's been a troubling question for me.
Was it good that who Abraham took the ram?
Yeah, I took the.
Yeah, I mean, God gave him the ram in place of Isaac. Yes, that was no, it was good.
I'm just wondering how they didn't hear like some ram like.
Hey, real quick, homework. We didn't get to Jacob, so ignore read Genesis 37 through 50 because we didn't get that far in the story yet. We'll start with Jacob and Esau in the next lesson, and then that will be part of it. But do listen to these Bible Project podcasts. If you're a podcast person, it's Family of God, Bible Project, episodes 4 and 5. It talks about Abraham. It talks about his sons and his grandsons. And it will establish some more of those like links for you between what's happening in the story and what we see. Like there's like themes that run throughout the Old Testament. These like design patterns. One of them is sibling rivalry. We've seen that with Cain and Abel. We'll see that pick up again with Jacob and Esau and Joseph and his brothers. Like these are things that like once you know how to read for them, it like gives like just a whole different layer to the Bible. Yes, Brenda.
When you're done lecturing this, can you switch it back to the one that shows all the lines so that we can go on?
Yes. Which one? This one? Okay, yeah. So we got to Abraham and Isaac, and then we'll pick up with Jacob and Esau next time. Thank you guys for paying attention and listening. And I took that off because I meant for us to get all the way up to Joseph, and we didn't. So I had them reading the Joseph story. But that will just be, I guess that'll just be homework for next time, and we'll pick up with Jacob and Esau, and then skip Joseph and go straight into. Actually, no, I take that back. Go ahead and read those Joseph stories, if you have time. Go ahead and read Genesis 37 to 50 because we're not going to spend a lot of time on that next class. We'll go from Jacob and we'll skip straight into the Exodus. So if you because we're going to come back to that at the end of our sessions. We're doing our our Bible study techniques, and the Joseph story is going to be one of the stories that we pick apart with our Bible techniques. So we will come back to that, but go ahead and read it if you have a chance, just so you understand where we're going. Good work today, everybody. Thank you.